Hey guys, and welcome to this video about Aperture. If you're watching this, you're probably either new to photography altogether or trying to make that transition from auto mode to manual mode. Now there's no award for using manual mode. At the end of the day, it's the image that counts. But I guarantee you'll be a better photographer than the one you used to be if you know how to use Aperture to your advantage and all the other settings, but this particular video is just trying to focus on Aperture. It's definitely one of the most important settings you can have on a camera, and the lens itself is arguably the most important part of image making. So to help me explain it a bit better, because it can get quite complicated and hard to get your head around at first, I brought with me this lens, which is actually a lens for my medium format camera, which I have just down here, which has got another lens on it, but this one's a bit easier to read. Anyway, I brought this with me to explain f-stops, which is how we call Aperture, which is how we measure the increments between each one. It's also very handy with this lens because it has a slider here that allows you to actually close the diaphragm to the aperture that you've set it at. So I can show you exactly what's happening inside the lens. So first of all, the way we measure aperture is in f-stops, and the difference between each f-stop is about 1.4 times greater than the last one. But on a lens like this, it's marked, each f-stop is marked, so it goes up in increments. So we'll start at 5.6, for example. Your lens on your digital camera, if that's what you're using, probably could go lower than that. But we'll start at 5.6, and then it goes 8, 11, 16, 22, 32, and on this lens it goes up to 45, which is quite rare. And then obviously you've got fractions in between all of those f-stops. It doesn't just go up like that, you have small fractions in between each one. On your digital camera you've probably got really tiny fractions. But the reason I'm telling you that is because if you were to become someone's photography assistant and they said, oh, can you adjust the aperture on the camera by 1 stop or 2 stops, you'd know exactly what that means. There is also another way of measuring aperture, which is T, but that's for cinema lenses or cine lenses. I don't think I'm going to explain too much about that one. It's just another way of measuring aperture. It's almost exactly the same, but if you see T3, for example, that's probably more equivalent to an f3.5 or something. It's just a little bit lower, but you know, there's not a lot in it. But to be honest, we should stick to f-stops and f-numbers because that's what this video is all about. So here's where it starts getting a little bit hard to get your head around. A small aperture number is a large actual aperture. So backtrack a little bit. Aperture, the word literally means opening, and all we're referring to when we say aperture is the size of the hole in the diaphragm of the lens. Diaphragm is the bit that closes in and out like that, and the main thing that aperture controls is the amount of light that's let in. However, it comes with a lot of added bonuses or nuisances, depending on which way you go, with the changes in the size of the aperture. For example, you may have heard of group F64, which was a group of photographers including Ansel Adams, who basically decided that photography should be as perfect as possible, completely all in focus, completely sharp, and as the name of their group suggests, they would often shoot at f64. Now this lens is the only lens I've owned that's actually come close to having f64 as an option. It has f45, which is very close, but I wouldn't shoot this lens at f45 ever. The other one on the camera, this is just the standard lens, that goes up to f32, which is 1 stop lower than f45. Now the mistake I made when I first found out about this group was I was doing landscape photography, much like they were, especially Ansel Adams, and I thought, that's perfect. For landscapes, it's great to have the whole thing perfectly in focus and a shallow depth of field, which I'll come back to later. And I thought, great, I'll put all my lenses as small an aperture as they'll go, so as big a number as possible, so a really small hole in the diaphragm. Thought I'll set the camera up on a tripod, I'll put the aperture as small as it will go, and I'll have perfectly sharp image without a doubt. Turns out it doesn't work like that. It's not just a case of the higher up the numbers you go, the sharper your image will be. Lenses, and this is important to understand and actually test your individual lens, they peak. They have a peak and they have an optimum range of apertures which they work best in. Even if the lens you've got has the option to shoot at f32, doesn't mean it's going to perform well at that aperture. Same with the other end of the scale. The result was that when I scanned the image in, the automatic scanning system really over sharpened it to compensate, and it just looks kind of bitty and nasty. And that is because of diffraction. So there's actually no way around this. It's not a question of buy a really expensive lens and this won't happen. This is just scientifically how light works. Diffraction is essentially when you have a small aperture and light passes through it. It comes in really big and then it has to go through the small aperture and it splits. Probably not my best explanation, but there you go. And so it kind of loses its quality. And what you have to realise is that Group F64 were shooting on big 8x10 large format cameras. And so that also changes how aperture affects the image. So the camera I'm currently recording this video with is a crop sensor DSLR. Most of the lenses I use with it typically peak at about f11 and have a good range between somewhere between f6.3 and f11, somewhere between there. Here's where I should probably start talking about depth of field. So you've almost definitely heard of depth of field. It's basically, yes, it's background blur. Essentially what you have with a lens is, and this is any lens, it will project a spherical image, a circular image, onto your rectangular sensor. And the rectangular sensor will be just large enough to get to the edge of the circle, so that you don't see the circle. Sometimes you may have heard of vignetting. That's light fall off basically, and that usually happens at wider apertures, so lower number. So all the way wide open, f1.4 if your lens can do that. You may get slight light fall off around the edges, and that's basically the edge of the circle that the lens is transmitting onto the sensor. So that's kind of the other end of the scale, opposite to diffraction experienced at f32, 45, etc. Anyway, the reason I had to explain that is because I wanted to explain that lenses have a plane of focus, which typically is a near enough straight line, except on ultra wide angle lenses where it starts to wave. But the plane of focus is essentially a straight line, especially if you're shooting wide open. It becomes more sensitive, it becomes thinner the wider the aperture, and this is why if you're shooting a portrait at f1.8, you'll get really lovely background blur, but if you've just focused on the person's nose by accident or something, their eyes are going to be out of focus. It's that sensitive. If you stop down to say 5.6, their whole face will be nicely in focus, you get less background blur, but it will probably still be pushed out of focus. And then say f11, something like that, you're probably going to get the background in focus as well. And back to my earlier point, so that camera there is a crop sensor DSLR. The background blur is going to be a lot different to that of this medium format camera because it has a larger image area, and so the bokeh or background blur will behave differently depending on the aperture. So with this, if I was shooting a portrait, I could have the aperture at f8 and I'd still get a really nicely blurred background. I've been talking too long. I probably had to stop down to f16, something like that, to get a nicely, completely in focus image, which is why these lenses have that option of a smaller aperture, a higher number, because they need it, because the overall image will have behaved differently. And that's why on those massive 8x10 cameras I was talking about earlier with the f64 group, that's why they were shooting at f64, because the lenses they were using were adapted to it, and they needed that high number for that massive image area to get a shallow depth of field, i.e. all in focus. I mentioned earlier that aperture controls the amount of light that's let in, which is absolutely true, but it behaves differently to shutter speed. I'm not going to talk about shutter speed in this video because this video is about aperture, but just one key point to come away with is aperture does control the amount of light that comes in, but not as significantly as shutter speed. So aperture does a lot more than shutter speed. As I've mentioned, all the things that aperture does, changes the depth of field, sharpness, all of that. Also changes contrast, which is what I was talking about, your lens's peak performance. It actually will control the quality of the light that comes in. So the colours, the contrast, how well the image looks is all down to the lens, which is why I said it's arguably the most important part of image making. It's the glass itself. The shutter speed, if you really want to drastically change the amount of light that's coming in or is falling on the sensor, then you change the amount of time the light is falling on the sensor for. And one last thing about image quality, which is affected by aperture. As I mentioned, at the higher end of the scale, the smaller the aperture, the higher the number. You get diffraction. At the other end, wide open, so if you're shooting at night time or in a dark area. And this really probably applies to nearly all lenses. It doesn't really matter about the price of the lens, this is just how light works. So you'll get chromatic aberration, vignetting, purple fringing. They're all kind of similar things, but they're all down to shooting wide open. So consider just stopping down a couple of stops and that'll probably just get rid of it. They're all fixable in Lightroom or any other software, but do you really want to be spending that time when you could have just flicked one button on your camera to avoid that? Now I know this is probably quite a lot to take in, and it was just on aperture, it wasn't really including any of the camera settings that will be affected by what aperture you're choosing. You'll need to compensate with them as well. But hopefully this will take you one step closer to getting to manual mode. The key thing to put into practice after watching this video is test your lens through all of its apertures. Put it in, if you've got the right camera for it, put it in aperture priority mode, that's the A mode on your dial. Just for now let the camera do the rest of the settings while you change the aperture. Start at the lowest it will go, the widest it will go, and go all the way to the end, and have it on a tripod, something nice and light. You could normally print off aperture testing charts, which are really good, and they will highlight all of those issues that I talked about that can be had at certain apertures. And you will see when your lens starts to get rid of all those issues and starts to become really sharp and have really nice contrast and colours in a certain range of apertures, and then you'll see when it starts to fall off as well. And it's good to know because maybe your lens peaks at a smaller aperture than most other ones, which would be useful because you could be shooting at that aperture for a certain reason, depending on what you're shooting. So that is the absolute best thing you can do to understand aperture. I hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.